The key question now in the argument, the bottom, as we're getting down to the bottom of the outline here, why think that these New Testament authors told the truth? Do we have any good reasons or evidence to think that what they said about these miracles was really true? So that's what we're going to spend the next 3 weeks on, trying to answer that question. Why think the New Testament authors were telling the truth? Now, the method we're going to use is not unique to this field, biblical studies, if you will, or trying to make a case for the truthfulness of the New Testament. The techniques or the methods that we're going to be using are very, very common in 2 other fields. The first field is just history, right? So whenever historians are trying to know what took place in the past, and they have, ancient manuscripts, ancient documents, they have historical sources, they're trying to figure out if these sources are trustworthy or not, they're going to use the methodology that we're going to be using here. So we're going to use some of their tools. We're going to see how they make decisions and then carry on like they do. And that's why we'll see a lot of historians that work in this field, and we'll quote and see a lot of them who do this type of work apply their historian skills to the New Testament, if you will. The other field that uses this type of technique, this sort of methodology, is in the legal arena, right? Think about it for a moment, the legal context. So you've got detectives, let's say, lawyers, judges, who are trying to recreate the past, similar to a historian. Maybe they're trying to figure out who the murderer was. Maybe they're looking at the evidence. They have certain witnesses who claim to have seen it with their own eyes. So they're trying to piece together what happened in the past from all of these sources of evidence. And the techniques and the methodology that they use is exactly what we'll be using as well when we evaluate these New Testament authors, these so-called eyewitnesses. Like everything we've said this semester, we want to be careful that we're not claiming to do more than we can really do. In other words, I'm not claiming that I can prove the New Testament authors told the truth with absolute certainty. There is just no airtight argument or piece of evidence that would prove that with absolute certainty. It's very much like historians have to work, like detectives, like lawyers and judges have to work. They have to evaluate the evidence and come to a conclusion based on the best evidence available. And I think, and I'm not the only one, we'll see there's many historians and people who work in the legal context who agree with me that the evidence the New Testament authors told the truth is very strong and very compelling. Okay? We're going to be looking for certain things that would make it more likely that they were telling the truth. So, in other words, if we see these things, it's more likely that they're telling the truth. There's certain things we're looking for, and we'll go over those here in just a minute. But before we do that, every week I want to introduce you to some experts in this field, okay? I want to introduce you to some, as we've done in the past, some academic sources that you can use in writing your papers, doing work even at UNL. And I want to give you some popular level resources so that popular level authors and speakers are very helpful in just breaking things down for us and making it more simple. Sometimes academics make it more difficult because they're gifted in the details, and that's necessary, but sometimes the details can be overwhelming. So the popular level authors and speakers can help break things down for us. However, we need these sort of sources as academic sources because they've done the real hardcore lifting, the real hardcore research. So here's one example of an academic resource for you. This guy, his name is Paul Meyer. He grew up in a Christian home, but he was always very driven to ask, is there evidence for this stuff? You know, he grew up, like many of us, in a Christian home, but he wanted to know if there was any good evidence for these things that he had been taught growing up as a Christian. So he got his master's degree at Harvard, got his terminal degree in Europe, and has been a professor now of ancient history at Western Michigan University. So good academic resource, professional historian, and he would be a great resource to use in writing any sort of academic papers that you have to write at university. So let me turn over to the tables for a little bit, and I want you guys to discuss this question. Consider if you were in one of those legal contexts. Let's say you were a detective, okay? And you were evaluating people who claim to be an eyewitness to a crime, a murder, let's say. What would lead you to think that they were telling the truth? Or what would lead you to think that these witnesses you're evaluating are actually lying? Right. And here are 6 things that, as I said, historians look for, detectives, attorneys, judges look for. And if they have these things, they're more likely to believe the eyewitness testimony. Okay? And these are the 6 things that we're going to look at over the next few weeks that the New Testament authors all have. So here you go. Here's the 6. Why do we believe the New Testament authors told the truth? Well, the first reason is that they made their claims very soon after the event. You can see why that would be important. The second one, they were eyewitnesses. Eyewitness testimony is always better than hearsay or second, third, fourth, etc., etc. Third, their accounts are confirmed by other sources, by archaeology, historians, so on and so forth. Fourth, and this one will be really interesting, they record embarrassing details about themselves. Number 5, their stories cohere with one another. And I think you'll really enjoy that aspect of it, because that's one thing that actually they often get criticized about, that their stories don't cohere. But we'll evaluate that closely. And then number 6, they were willing to die for their beliefs. So here are 6 reasons in a nutshell why we believe the New Testament authors were telling the truth when they talked about Jesus' miracles. And we're going to cover 2 per week. So you math majors out there have already figured it out. It's going to take us 3 weeks to get through these. So let's just go in order, one at a time. The first one. They made their claims soon after the event. Think about it for a moment. Which George is more mythable? Which George is more mythable? Well, George Washington, of course, because, right? I mean, think about it for a moment. If a biography came out on both, which one would be easier to lie about? Well, it'd be easier to make up lies about George Washington because it would be harder to disconfirm those lies, right? Because he lived long ago and there aren't any eyewitnesses around, at least as far as we know, who were there and saw these things. You could still make up lies about George Bush, and that happens all the time, of course. But it's more difficult to get people to believe your lies because, well, for one thing, George Bush is alive. You could just ask him. And other eyewitnesses could either confirm or disconfirm. So it would be more difficult to make up lies about him because it's more recent. It's sooner after the event, per se. Now, historians know this, right? Historians know that the sooner something is written or the sooner a claim is made after an event, the the more likely it is to be true. All else equal. It doesn't guarantee the truthfulness. Obviously, somebody can make a lie up on the spot. But all else equal, if a claim is made earlier, that gives them more reason to believe it's true. Now, this flies in the face of the rumor and the idea out there, you've probably heard, that all of Jesus' miracles and his resurrection and his claim to be God were legends that developed many centuries or many decades, some would even say centuries, after the fact, right? And then you know why they would say those things, because that would cause you to question whether it was really true if, let's say, for example, nobody talked about Jesus' resurrection until like 300 years after he lived. Well, that obviously would make you more suspicious about it if that was the case, right? All else equal. So, what we're going to look at here is how early these supposed eyewitnesses were claiming Jesus' miracles and his resurrection. Is there any evidence that they made their claims fairly early? Well, to do this, let's look at a timeline real briefly here. We'll go through this pretty quick, but I wanted to look at with you a timeline for the writing of the New Testament. Right? If you ever take seminary classes, this is a huge course. Sometimes it's broken up into several courses you have to take at seminary, studying this historical information, trying to figure out when the various books in the New Testament were written. A lot of conversations, a lot of discussion about this. We're trying to recreate history 2,000 years ago. There's disagreements about it. But there are some things that are fairly well established. And so the arguments I'm going to be making for you tonight aren't very detailed. They're more high level, and they're mostly agreed upon by Christian and non-Christian scholars concerning the dating of the New Testament. So take a look at this timeline here. Now, the big two events that are kind of going to be our goalpost, if you will, just to kind of give us a frame of reference, is the cross. Happened in the early 30s. Might not know the exact year, but most everybody agrees it's the early 30s when Jesus died. And then, of course, the destruction of Jerusalem, the invasion of Jerusalem, and the destruction of the Jewish temple, which took place in 70 AD. Okay. Now everybody agrees that those two dates. So that's what we're starting with, the cross and the destruction of the temple. Now, a fairly compelling argument can be made that most, if not all, of the New Testament was written before the destruction of the temple. So a fairly sound argument can be made, and is made by historians and scholars, that the New Testament, most of it, if not all of it, was written before this event in 70 AD. Think about it for a moment. The New Testament letters, if you're familiar with them, or even the narratives in the New Testament, they all talk and write about Jerusalem and the temple as though it's all fine and dandy. They don't mention anything about the temple being destroyed or Jerusalem being invaded, right? They don't mention that at all in the New Testament. So think about it for a moment. If, let's say, this year, 2019, somehow America was invaded and some foreign nation took over Washington, D.C. Who should we have be the bad guys tonight? What foreign nation could come in and take over D.C.? Greece. All right. Greece comes in with the help of North Korea, and they invade D.C. and destroy the White House. Let's say that happens in the next month. So 2019, this huge event, right? Well, let's say 10 years from now, you're reading a book about America, and it doesn't mention this event. What would you conclude about that book? Well, most likely, a decent conclusion would be that it was written before Greece and North Korea invaded, right? Because to leave that out, such an earth-shattering, if you will, event, in our nation's history, it would be odd to leave that out. So if it's not included in this book you're reading 10 years from now, I think you could safely conclude that book was written before 2019. Well, similarly, since the New Testament ends the narrative and the letters, and they don't discuss anything about this, that has led a lot of people to think that most, if not all, of the New Testament then was written before 70 AD. Here's some other things we want to put down on the timeline. The death of Paul. There's good historical evidence that Paul died, was martyred sometime in the mid-60s. Probably don't know the exact year, but most historians would agree mid-60s is when Paul died. We have even more evidence for James. You might remember James. He's the half-brother of Jesus, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So big figure in early Christianity. And a Jewish historian, so not a Christian, a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus records that this James, the half-brother of Jesus, was killed in the early 60s. So really solid historical evidence for that. Well, what can we conclude then, knowing these deaths? Well, similarly, when you read the New Testament, these two key figures, their deaths are not recorded. So the narrative of the New Testament ends with James and Paul going about doing their business, going about doing their missionary work, going about doing their church leading and teaching. It ends with both of these individuals still alive, which would lead people to think then that a lot of the New Testament was written before these guys passed away. Specifically, the book of Acts. Because Acts is just that, a narrative of the early church. As you know, the New Testament is made up mostly of epistles or letters. You know, like you would write a letter to a friend or write a letter to somebody. Most of the New Testament is made up of these letters, but Acts is unique in the sense that it's a narrative of these events of the early church. The key people, the key events that took place in the early church. And the book of Acts ends with Jerusalem fine, the temple fine, James fine, Paul fine, going about doing their ministry. So that would lead people to think that Acts was probably written before these guys were killed. Now, if Acts was written before they died, we know Luke, the Gospel of Luke, had to be written before that. Because Luke is part one of a two-part series. Luke explains that. He wrote Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and he wrote Acts, part one, part two. History of Jesus' ministry, then the history of the early church, Acts. So if he wrote part two, let's say early 60s or before, we know Luke has to be dated before that. Now, Luke wasn't an eyewitness, and we'll see that tonight. Luke himself wasn't an eyewitness. He was a researcher, if you will. He researched and interviewed those who were eyewitnesses. And then the Apostle Paul is who gave his seal of approval on the Gospel of Luke. Most scholars think that Mark was written before Luke. And some would even say that Luke used Mark as one of his resources in writing his account. That Mark was a resource that he used, which is very viable. I think a lot of people make good arguments for that. So that puts Mark before Luke. Now, of all the New Testament books, there's 27 of them, of all the New Testament books, the ones that have the most historical evidence for them are 5 or 6 letters by the Apostle Paul, right? All 27 have good historical evidence, but some have better evidence than others. And the ones that have the best or the most amount of evidence are 5 or 6 letters by Paul. He wrote 13 in our New Testament, but about half of them have just a tremendous amount of historical evidence for them. Some of them are Romans, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians. And he talks about his imminent death in some of them as well. So early 60s, people are fairly confident dating Paul's letters to at least the early part of that decade. Another letter by Paul has even more evidence, an earlier letter, and that is 1 Corinthians. So 1 Corinthians, virtually all scholars agree 1 Corinthians was written in the mid-50s. 53, 55, 57, somewhere in the mid-50s, right? Almost everybody agrees is when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. Now this is all fairly impressive. This is all, and if you read these accounts, they're full of miracles. They're claiming Jesus was God. They're claiming that Jesus rose from the dead. And all of this is fairly early. Right? If the cross, Jesus' ministry, and then his death and resurrection took place in the early 30s, we've got folks now, we've got fairly good historical evidence. We can make a good historical case, and many have, New Testament scholars, that they were making these claims then within a few decades after the event. Fairly early. Still eyewitnesses alive, still people who saw these things and could confirm or disconfirm them. So fairly early. So this is all great. This is all wonderful. But we have something even better. We can go even further back than this. And this is an awesome story. I love telling this story. I think you guys will get a kick out of it. So we have information that goes all the way back to the 30s. That could be dated into the 30s. And here's the story about how this stuff was discovered. This is actually discovered by liberal scholars, and I don't mean Democrats. When I say liberal scholars, I mean those who don't believe the miraculous claims of the New Testament. They don't believe Jesus was really God or rose from the dead. They might not even believe that there is a God, right? So they're liberal theologically in that sense. And they have this idea, right, that if they would get back through their historical methods, get back to the original historical Jesus, they'll just find a good moral teacher. Again, they've discounted miracles, they've discounted the possibility of him being God, and so they're convinced that if they can push back into history and get to the real historical Jesus, they're going to find just a good moral teacher, never claimed to be God, never claimed to do miracles. All that stuff was legends that developed later. Okay, so that was their attempt. That's what they thought they would discover. So they used their historical methods, which is what we're using. There's nothing wrong with their historical methods. They just had maybe some presuppositions as to what they would find using their historical method. So they pushed back and they pushed back, and they used their historical method to get as close to the cross as possible, as close to Jesus' life as possible. And what they did, long story short, they discovered some very early creeds. Okay, you know what a creed is. Maybe sometimes at your church you'll recite the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. A creed is simply a little succinct statement of your beliefs, right? Usually only a few sentences, and it's just a way for a group of people to recite together. Sometimes even before folks were literate, it was just a good way to memorize things. And so a creed is just a summary of people's belief systems. And they discovered these early creeds that they dated back to the 30s. So now we're talking just a few years after Jesus' ministry and death on the cross. They actually found 41 of these creeds. Okay? So you understand what I'm saying here. This is pre-New Testament material. This is material, historical documents that date back before the New Testament. Early Christian belief creeds. So what did the early Christians say? What did these creeds say? Did they describe Jesus as just a good moral teacher, like they thought they would find? Take a look at probably the most famous of these 41 creeds. I received what I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12, the disciples. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers, church, at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have passed away, fallen asleep, died. Now, you might recognize this creed. This comes from 1 Corinthians 15. And yes, these creeds are found in the New Testament, but these liberal New Testament scholars, using their historical method, figured out that these creeds predate the New Testament. I mean, think about it for a moment. If Paul is quoting these as creeds, what must that mean? If he's quoting them in his letters, and we have good historical evidence for the dating of Paul's letters, and he's quoting these creeds in his letters, well, we know just from that alone that these creeds have to predate his letters for him to be able to quote them, and that his readers would know and find familiar these creeds that he's quoting. So this is how liberal scholars determined this is pre-New Testament material, and it kind of backfired on them, right? Because it clearly describes a miraculous Jesus, at least his resurrection. And if you look at all the 41 creeds, it's the picture that us conservative scholars, conservative Christians, would understand him to be. The one who claimed to be God, did miracles, and rose from the dead. So this has caused, and this is fairly recent, over the last few decades, that this sort of historical work has been done on these creeds. But this sort of evidence has led many scholars, Christian, non-Christian scholars, it has led them to the conclusion that these miracle claims, and in particular Jesus' resurrection claims, were made very, very early after the fact, very, very soon after the events, after the fact. So consider this quote. This is from an atheist New Testament scholar. So he doesn't believe there is a God. So right from the get-go, he would not be open to the possibility of miracles, right, as we've discussed. So he doesn't think that Jesus rose from the dead. However, as a historian, he is compelled by this evidence, particularly these creeds, to the conclusion that within 2 years, the early Christians were proclaiming Jesus rose from the dead. Now again, this doesn't guarantee it's true. People can make up lies on the spot. However, all else equal, if claims are made very soon after the event, it's more likely that they're true compared to if these claims were not brought up for hundreds of years later, right? So I'll let you guys discuss at your table if, and I know you don't have the historical evidence in front of you, right? And I've given you books, you can dig through the historical evidence if you'd like to, or write a paper about this stuff, good academic sources. But let's say, right, that there is good evidence that the New Testament authors were making these claims soon after the event. How much does that increase the likelihood they were telling the truth? Remember, we've got 6 of these to cover over the next few weeks. And the second one is they were eyewitnesses. They were eyewitnesses. You can imagine detectives, lawyers, judges. They're always going to find eyewitness testimony more reliable than second-hand material, third-hand, fourth-hand. I love the scene in, Spaceballs, where I know that your cousin was my brother's roommate in college, and it goes so far back that it's almost meaningless. But if somebody was there and saw with their own eyes, that gives them that much more credibility. Now, the first thing I want to note here is that the New Testament isn't just one source. As I've said before, the New Testament is 27 books written by 9 authors. So there's a sense in which just if all we had was the New Testament, there we have 9 eyewitness sources. Or I shouldn't say that. Some of them weren't eyewitnesses. But we have 9 early sources for this material. Like I said before, Luke was an eyewitness, but he went around and interviewed eyewitnesses. So his was secondhand. But clearly, some of them did claim to be eyewitnesses, and they seem to know the value in that. This seems to be fairly common sense, right? Detectives, judges, attorneys, historians, they would prefer eyewitness testimony. And that's just common sense. So the New Testament authors seem to have known that from the very beginning, how important it was that they saw these things with their own eyes. John is very explicit in this one particular letter. He said, but not only did we see these miracles in Jesus' resurrected body with our own eyes, we touched it. And we're testifying, we're giving witness, just like a witness in a courtroom, right? We're testifying of these things that we saw and touched. So they claim to be eyewitnesses, but let's be honest. It's fairly easy to claim you were an eyewitness. Are there any reasons we have to believe that they really were there? So here's one thing that detectives, lawyers, judges look at to try to figure this out. Just imagine, right? There was a murderer, and you're trying to figure out who committed the murder, what happened, and a few days later, somebody comes forth claiming to be an eyewitness. Maybe they said they didn't come forward right away because they were scared, but now they got their confidence, their courage. They've come to the police, you're the detective, and they claim to have seen the murder. Well, how do you know that they really saw it with their own eyes? Maybe they're just claiming to be an eyewitness, but maybe they have an ulterior motive. They didn't really see it. They want to try to deceive you for some reason. Well, I think one thing a detective would look at is to try to figure out if they know the surrounding context fairly well. Does that make sense? So let's say you as a detective already know from other sources that it was raining at the time of the murder, and there were several cars parked nearby. Okay, and you know that from other sources or a security camera or whatever. You know certain things about the situation. And if this eyewitness would come to you and say, no, it was a sunny day, there weren't any cars around, well then red flags would go off in your mind, and you would think to yourself, man, they don't even know the context accurately. It doesn't seem like they can be trusted. However, all else equal, let's say they are right on those things. Well, then, you're more likely to believe that they're telling the truth. Does that make sense? And sometimes you've seen this in movies and TV shows. The detectives or the police will actually put misinformation out there, right? They'll say things about the crime scene that aren't actually true, and have the newspapers and the television news report that. They'll put things that are false in those reports so that when so-called eyewitnesses come forth and they say things that are false information that they put in the newspaper, they'll know immediately they weren't there, and they just picked up this information from the newspapers they read, right? So those are the type of things that lawyers, judges, detectives, police officers are looking for to see if they really were eyewitnesses. How well do they know the contextual situation? So let's take that and apply that then to these so-called eyewitnesses. How well do they know the contextual context, the scenario in which these things took place? And we'll start with Luke. Okay, we'll start with Luke. He's not an apostle, but he did run with Paul, and he was not an eyewitness to Jesus' miracles and resurrection, but he was an eyewitness in the later events, like during Acts. He ran with Paul during that period. Luke was fairly well educated for the time. He was possibly a doctor. And as I said, he wrote the book of Acts. Now, he was a very detailed writer, and explained when he wrote the first part of Luke that he carefully researched these things and wrote them down in a consecutive order or in a good, trustworthy order. So let's just focus in on the book of Acts, because as I said before, Acts is unique in the New Testament in that it is a narrative. It's just historically, according to Luke, what happened sequentially. Some of the other New Testament books are just letters. There's not as much historical information in there, so that's why we're focusing on the book of Acts. Now, Acts is just full of all sorts of historically accurate information. Take a look at this quote. This is from Roman historian, contemporary historian, A.N. Sherwin White. It's from his work, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. And in there you can find this quote from him. He says, "For Acts, the confirmation of historicity is just overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted." Now he's not necessarily talking about the miracles in the book of Acts, right? He's just talking about the historicity of it. And I'll show you some examples here in just a minute. Another historian by the name of Colin Hemmer, that'd be a good resource for you, Colin Hemmer, H-E-M-E-R, he lists out, at a minimum, 84 accurate historical facts in the book of Acts. I'm talking about historical facts that would be very, very difficult to know if you weren't there yourself. Very similar to like a supposed eyewitness who claimed to have been there at a murder scene. It'd be very difficult for them to know these facts, this information, if they weren't there themselves. For example, in the book of Acts, you have the names and technical titles, positions of obscure rulers. In the book of Acts, you have very precise geography and travel routes that people took during that time. In the book of Acts, you have very unusual cultural practices that they encountered. A lot of what Acts is about is them going to various cultures and telling people about Jesus. And so they encounter some fairly unique cultures who have strange practices that would be hard to know about if you weren't there yourself to see it and experience. Strange cultural customs and even slang words that were used in different regions in the first century by these various people groups that we know from history. So all these things that Luke records in Acts, not really purposefully, I don't think really with any intention other than he's just recording what they did and where they went. And he records as a good writer, this information that then is corroborated by other historical information. In other words, he knows the crime scene very, very well. Now imagine, this was 2,000 years ago, so it's not as though they had Google where they could just look these things up, right? This would be stuff that would be very difficult to know unless you were there at that time. As the example, similar situation, let's say people knew all of these things about your hometown. I don't know where you're from, maybe a small town here in Nebraska. And let's say that somebody knew all about your small town, about 100 years ago. Names, events, slang words, people's nicknames, travel routes, all these things about your hometown about 100 years ago. Before there was Google and all that stuff, people would just look it up now. Well, if you had somebody that had written something about your hometown 100 years ago that included all of that accurate historical information that you could corroborate based on other sources, then you would have a lot of, you would find them to be a fairly credible source, because how else could they know these things unless they were there or interviewed people who were there in your town, the small town that you're from. So let me just give you an example real quick. We don't have all that much time to just work through all this data and information. I've given you resources and I'm giving you names where you can do further research if you'd like. But just to summarize it real quick, here's an example. Oh, before that, another quote. So this is archaeologist William Ramsey. Comes from a work that he wrote, St. Paul the Traveler and Roman Citizen. And he said, as a historian, archaeologist, I began with a mind unfavorable to the book of Acts, but more recently I found myself brought into contact with the book as an authority, really, historically, for the topography, antiquities, and early society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne in upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. So here's the example I was telling you about. We know from other historical sources that Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome. Okay? Give you an example. We know this from Suetonius, who was the chief secretary for the emperor. Okay, so just picture this in your mind for a moment. You got the emperor Claudius, and he kicked the Jews out of Rome. And we know this from the chief secretary who recorded this. His name was Suetonius. And as we're reading along in the book of Acts, what do we see? This is from Acts 18. Luke is just recording what's going on, who's going where, what they're doing, and why. And it records that Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found there a Jewish man named Aquila, native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Small little detail, if you're reading the book of Acts, you probably just blow by that without even thinking about it. But the fact that that is accurate historical information about the crime scene that's corroborated by others, and we have dozens of these, gives Luke a lot of credibility. I mean, he had no reason to include that. It just gives him credibility, the fact that he did include that among dozens and dozens of others. Just one example. Now, as I said before, Luke not only wrote Acts, but he wrote the Gospel of Luke, and so his credibility carries over to his other works, right? So it carries over to Luke, and this is how Luke starts off. I've mentioned this a couple times already, but here it is in black and white. He explains he's not an eyewitness. He says many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. It also seemed good to me, since I've carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in an orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus. So Luke's explaining that he claims, at least, to carefully have investigated these things. And based off his credibility from his writing in Acts, that credibility carries over to his work here as well. And let's just take a couple examples from the Gospel of Luke, similar to all the historical information that he records in Acts. So this is Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. And I won't read it up there. You can see there's just a lot of names, a lot of historical background. Oftentimes when we're reading the Bible for devotional purposes, we just blow through this material. But as a historian, now that we're evaluating the New Testament with our historian hats on, this is very valuable information. Maybe not good for devotions, but great for developing his historical credibility, right? So look at the things that he mentions here. Does it sound like he's making up a story? I mean, it doesn't start out like Star Wars starts out, right? A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or once upon a time. It doesn't start out like a fairy tale. No, he gives an exact date. Based on what we know from other historical sources, we know he's talking about the year AD 29. He dates it. 8 people that he mentions are known from other historical sources. We know that all 8 of them lived at this exact time. And as I said, this just doesn't read like a fairy tale, like a myth. When you've read Greek mythology, you know how those stories are written. And this just does not read like that. It seems like he at least is claiming to be writing real history. So I'm just trying to give you some examples. A lot of this stuff is very detailed, very fact-oriented, so I feel like I'm just spouting fact after fact after fact to you. But these are the type of things that I think develop their credibility. Here's a list. Somebody put together a list of all of the, I don't think it's all of them, I just think it's a good list. I don't think it's exhaustive. But here's a list of at least 31 historical figures mentioned in the New Testament. These are 31 people that we know from other historical sources that lived during this time, and they're mentioned and described in the crime scene, in the context of Jesus doing these miracles and being resurrected. Here's the rest of the list. So we're almost ready to wrap it up here. I just have a few minutes left, but I want to let you guys discuss one last time. And here's your question. Similar to the previous one, remember we're going through 6 of these reasons to believe the New Testament authors told the truth. And so discuss this one. If they were eyewitnesses who accurately knew facts about the context, about the crime scene, how much does that increase the likelihood they were telling the truth? Similar situation, eyewitness comes forth, claimed to have seen a murder, and they get all the details right that you know from other sources about the scene, the weather, who else was there, how many gunshots, etc., etc. If they get all that information right, and then they also claim to know who the murderer is, how much likelihood does that give you that they're telling the truth about who the murderer is if they've got all those other details correct? Similar situation to what we've seen here with the New Testament authors. Imagine, if you will, Luke, the other New Testament authors, got all this information wrong. That would completely destroy their credibility, right? You see the difference? The fact that they got it right doesn't prove with absolute certainty, nothing would do that they're telling the truth. But it sure helps their case. How much? If all we had was this to go on, I think it's fairly strong. But we're looking at 6 of these, right? We've got 6 reasons that at least that we're looking at to think that they told the truth. And remember what we're not doing. Remember what we're not doing. Remember what we're not claiming. We're not claiming that this proves they were telling the truth with 100% certainty. There's nothing that will get us to that level. I beat that dead horse as much as I possibly can. But rightfully so, because I don't want to overstate our case here. I think just like a good detective, like a good attorney, we can make a fairly strong case that they were telling the truth, but we're never going to get to that 100% certainty. No court of law attempts to get to 100% certainty because it's just not possible. It's just not possible. I will say it's easy to be the skeptic, as I said last week. It's easy. It's so easy. And I grow weary sometimes with possibilities. You know, I have conversations with folks and they're, it's so easy just to throw out possibilities. Well, could this have happened? Could Jesus have married Mary Magdalene? And now there's this bloodline that exists. Sure, that's possible. Is it possible that Judas died on the cross instead of Jesus? Well, of course it's possible. I mean, anything, almost anything. Was Jesus an alien from another planet? I'm open to that possibility. It's so easy to throw out skeptical possibilities, right? We can do that till the cows come home, right? Of course, all those things are, I'm open to all of those possibilities. But that's not what we're looking for, right? We're not looking for possibilities. You know, when somebody throws me out a possibility, the first thing I ask them is, all right, show me the money. Show me the evidence you've got for your possibility, right? What first century eyewitness accounts do you have? Right? Show those to me. I'm open to it. Give me reasons, give me evidence to believe in your hypothesis. I've got a hypothesis. Jesus really rose from the dead. Here's my reasons for believing it. I think I can make a good case that I've got first century eyewitness testimony. I think Jesus married Mary Magdalene. Fine, I'm open to that possibility. Give me your first century eyewitness testimony, and I'll look at it. So possibilities are easy, but that's not what we're looking for. We're looking at least for probabilities. At least for probabilities. You know, what's most probable based on the reasons and evidence that we have to look at.